I have swept the hall for 40 years, and in 40 years I never once touched the ward. That was the rule, though no one alive remembered who had made it. The Hall of the Still Order sits at the end of a long stone causeway on Veshtara, a moon nobody visits except pilgrims, scholars, and the occasional tax officer come to ask why a moon with no export worth the fuel still keeps a caretaker on its books. I was that caretaker. My grandmother had been caretaker before me, and her father before her, back through a line of vest sweepers so long that the name had come to mean broom hand as much as it meant family. The hall itself is vaulted stone, cracked open along one whole wall where some old war had torn the roof loose, so that daylight falls straight down through the broken dome onto the altar at the center. On that altar, a blade rests, point down, hilt upward, hanging in the air with nothing beneath it. No chain, no stand. It simply hovers, the way a held breath hovers, waiting to be let out. Around it, a barrier of pale light stands like glass you cannot see until you walk into it. 300 years, the old records say, since the Still Order's last warden closed that ward and walked out of the hall and never came back. 300 years since anyone crossed it. Pilgrims come to look. They press their palms flat an inch from the light, feel the faint hum against their skin, and leave satisfied they've touched something ancient. Scholars come to measure it, to argue about what the order was, a court of law, some say, that stood between the two star nations of the Kavan and the ossuary kingdoms, when they nearly burned each other's worlds down. A neutral hand, a blade that belonged to no side, so it could belong to both. I never had an opinion on it. I swept the floor around their arguing feet, and let them believe whatever made the walk up the causeway worth it. My grandmother taught me the chant when I was 7, the summer she first put a broom in my hands. It wasn't a song exactly, 3 low notes, over and over, timed to the stroke of the bristles. Sweep hum, she said her mother had taught it to her the same way, said it kept your hands honest, kept you from rushing the corners. I never asked where it came from before that. It was just the sound work made in our family, the way some families hum while they knead bread or when they wash a floor. I did it without thinking, the same as breathing. She died when I was 30, and I buried her without ever learning where the chant began. That was the way of things on Veshtara. You inherited a task, a broom, a set of aching knees, and you did not ask questions that had no answers left to give them. I had long since stopped wondering. A man can only carry a mystery so far before he sets it down and simply lives beside it, the way I lived beside that hovering blade for 40 years, dusting the floor an arm's length from it, and never once feeling the pull to reach further. I was 61 years old the evening it happened, an ordinary evening, no anniversary, no ceremony, nothing on the order's calendar, because nobody keeps that calendar anymore. The last pilgrim group had gone. I was closing up, sweeping the grit that always drifts in from the broken dome, working my way toward the altar the way I did every night, humming those same 3 notes the way I had 10,000 nights before. I had never swept that close to the ward. I don't know why that night was different. Maybe my knees ached less. Maybe the light through the broken roof caught my eye at the wrong angle and pulled my feet forward. Whatever the reason, my broom came within a hand's width of the barrier, and the hum was still in my throat when the light answered it. It didn't shatter, it didn't crack like glass. It simply softened, the way frost softens under a warm hand, and then it wasn't there. I stood frozen with the broom still raised, close enough now that I could feel heat coming off the blade for the first time in my life. Not fire heat, but something older, like sun-warmed stone. A few pilgrims who'd lingered by the entrance came running back at the sudden silence where the hum of the ward used to be, and I heard someone say my name like a question, like they weren't sure it was still true. One of the scholars, a young woman who had spent 3 seasons measuring the altar stone with instruments she never once let me touch, stood in the broken doorway, with her hand pressed flat against her own collarbone. She did not step closer. None of them did. They had come for years to study a silence, And now that the silence had broken, they understood, the way animals understand weather before it arrives, that this was not a moment to crowd. They only watched, mouths parted, hands lifted halfway to their chests, afraid to breathe too loud and startle something they didn't have a name for. The blade turned. I want to be exact about this, because for years men will ask me how it moved, and I will only be able to tell them the truth. It turned the way a man turns when he hears his name spoken correctly for the first time in a long while. Unhurried, certain, glad. The point that had hung down toward the altar for 300 years, lifted, and swung, slow as a held breath let out, until it faced me. Gold light came up along the fuller of the blade, tracing letters I didn't know I could read, though I understood every one of them the instant they lit. Not shouted, not booming through the hall the way I'd have guessed a thing like that would speak. It came into me the way the hum had always come out of me. Low, 3 notes, timed like a heartbeat. The scale steadies. Rise, Warden King. I did not move for a long moment. Behind me I heard a scholar's breath catch, heard a pilgrim's hand come up over her mouth. I heard, distantly, my own broom hit the stone floor. My hands are not fine hands. 40 years of bristlewood has worn a groove into the pads of both palms, a callus shaped exactly like a hilt grip, though I had never in my life held anything grander than a broom handle and a tool crate. I looked down at them in that gold light and understood, all at once and too late to unknow it, what shape my grandmother's hands must have worn too, and her mother's before that. 300 years of women and men who scrubbed floors with the same grip a warrior uses to hold steady in a duel he never fought, humming a work chant that had once been a vow. The Kavan and the ossuary kingdoms never did burn each other's worlds down. Some treaty held, some old fear kept the peace, and slowly the reason for it, the order that had stood between them, was allowed to be forgotten, because peace makes people careless with the memory of what bought it. The wardens didn't vanish. I understand that now. They scattered, and hid, and swept floors, and taught their children 3 notes at a time, so the vow would survive, even after its purpose was buried, waiting for a hand worn the right way to come close enough for the ward to recognize it. I am an old man. My knees ache in the cold season, and I have never held anything more dangerous than a paring knife. I did not ask for this, any more than a man asks for the shape of his own hands. But the blade did not offer me a choice. It offered me a truth, and a truth, once spoken, cannot be swept back under the dust. I reached out, slow, the way you reach for something that has been waiting a long time and deserves to not be startled, and I closed my worn palm around the hilt for the first time in 300 years. It settled into my grip like it had been carved to that exact callus, and the gold light did not flare or blaze. It simply steadied, low and even, the way a held breath steadies once it's finally let go. I swept that hall for 40 years believing I was nobody in particular, keeping the dust off a mystery I'd never be trusted to understand. I know better now. Some inheritances don't come stamped on paper, or carried in a name spoken proudly at the table. Some of them are hidden 3 notes at a time. In the callus a broom leaves on a hand, waiting a very long while for someone humble enough to come close, without knowing what he was walking toward. I do not feel like a king. I feel like a man who finally understands why his grandmother's hands looked the way they did, and why she never once explained it. Some things you're only meant to carry until the day they're ready to be carried by someone else. I mean to find out, before I'm done, whether I'm equal to what she carried for me.